Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So it's time to embark on a large, and I expect rather controversial topic. No, it's not LFR, if you'll believe it. It's attunements, and they are something that I've wanted to talk about for a good long while now. I mean, hell, the first script of this video was written in June of this year. It was a 4,000 word monstrosity. Suffice to say, it was scrapped, but as much as attunements absolutely did have their problems, and I acknowledge them, they did create a fixed progression, and in many ways we still do have attunements today, just that instead of doing set bits of content in a progression, we instead chase down an item level bracket. Now, in case you aren't aware of what an attunement is, it's essentially a content gate. For an example, in TBC, in order to get into Tempest Keep, you had to clear a lot of content, and some of that even involved getting reputations. Maybe not the best move. The plus, though, is that it gives you a clear progression and a consistent goal to work towards. But of course, the negative aspect is that some of that content wasn't great. For example, some of the reputations. And as the expansion went on, it started to become more of a barrier to getting new alts and things like that into raids. Other than the item level requirements to certain bits of content, they haven't really done attunements that much since. Now, when many people say attunements would kill World of Warcraft, I assume they're thinking about directly porting the TBC or even WildStar's launch system over to the current game. I would say this in response. It's been a long time since 2007. If that was to be done again, I've got to imagine Blizzard would at least try to do it a bit better and be a little bit more innovative. Anyway, on to the meat of the video. One really key part of a role-playing game is the idea that your character is going through a journey of sorts. A criticism that I hear a lot, and do agree with, is that the journey of World of Warcraft is increasingly diminished as we go from expansion to expansion. For most PvE players, your goal is just to get better gear so you can get into raids, or maybe just get better gear for the sake of getting better gear because you need something to do during your downtime. In the current version of the game, this generally means dive bombing into Tanaan Jungle, spending a few days there, and doing the odd LFR. At Warlords of Draenor's launch, it was better though. It was a mix of doing dungeons, LFR, and the likes of, say, crafted gear. But in both cases, you could get your character raid ready in a very short amount of time. On top of that, neither of the scenarios that I described there offer a very cohesive experience. They feel very gamey, they feel very much like a bunch of loot systems have just been set out for you, and they're mostly devoid of a lot of the narrative and set-piece elements and wrappings that normally give gameplay a little bit of context. So how, roughly, would I go about doing achievements, bearing in mind that the goal is to provide a high-quality journey at the endgame? Well, first of all, we would kick it off with a super strong endgame narrative. One of their self-admitted issues with WoD was a lack of endgame narrative, so this kills two birds with one stone. This would also essentially just take the form of a questline which would contain quite a bit in the way of challenges which are akin to the legendary quest stuff, such as the Kairos and Garona encounters. And part of this narrative would also take place in the dungeon content of the expansion. However, it would not be in a completely linear, rigid manner. As you all know, I love the idea of winged dungeons, and one of the great things about winged dungeons is that you can have a narrative which really spans the different wings. So for an example, the patch 3.3 dungeons where you started off in the Forge of Souls, then you went to the Pit of Sauron, whatever, and then you went to the Halls of Reflection, and there was a narrative which tied those three dungeons together. So the more dungeon-focused parts of our attunement questline, they would send us to, for the sake of argument, let's just say 4 sets of 2 to 3 winged dungeons. You could tackle these sets of dungeons in whatever order you want, but you would have to progress through each set of dungeons in the right order the first time. So you're doing a natural progression. You're starting at dungeon A, which is the beginning dungeon, and ending at dungeon C, which is the end dungeon. Again, just like the patch 3.3 dungeons. So what have we done so far? Well, we've established lots of narrative content in the expansion's world, and we've then created narrative content which covers the dungeons of the expansion, and these dungeons would be crammed full of good quality narrative, including things like having full-blown cinematics at the end, the kind of stuff which really drives home that the enemies of the expansion are proper villains, and not just complete losers like Kargath and Ner'zhul who get wrecked in 2 minutes. I would also have it so that the winged dungeons have got a small raid at the end. Maybe 1, 2, or perhaps even 3 bosses. They would use the same tile sets as the dungeons so that the art people aren't going mad. Now, back in Wrath of the Lich King, they intended to have, for an example, Utgard Keep being a raid, but they eventually ran out of time. Overall, I think the format of having 3 or 4 sets of dungeons, which each have a raid encounter at the very top, is a really good way of doing things. In order to access the raid, you would have to clear through the preceding dungeons, of course. And this stuff is all a very rich narrative progression, which I think is a very key part of building a compelling world. It introduces you to the endgame threats of the expansion from a narrative sense in a way that actually makes sense, which is a thing that I really like. And it also creates a progression for you to overcome. The idea of overcoming a challenge is just such a base part of what makes video games compelling, and it's important to have that there. There would also be a main raid, obviously, which you would have to have cleared the preceding stuff to enter, so that would be your equivalent of Blackrock Foundry, Hellfire Citadel, stuff like that. Now, at a very base level, that's what I would like to happen. The exact route is up for debate, but that's essentially how I would do it. As far as rewards go, I would like there to be some form of special item. Does it have to be legendary? No, it just has to be memorable. And items are not memorable because of their text color, they're memorable because of what you did to get them. This system would also be better if dungeon sets of gear existed. Hell, how about getting a dungeon set piece drop that gives you a quest line that sends you out into the world to get your bit of gear? That could be a really cool experience. I just think this layout is overall very well positioned to deliver RPG content. The sort of stuff that maybe you think of more when you think about a single-player RPG, but that is very compelling and perhaps that World of Warcraft had more of in some of the times gone by. Difficulty levels are also a little bit of a tricky thing to work out. Personally, I would have normal dungeons be as hard as today's heroics, i.e. kind of shit easy, but not so much that you basically need to be someone with a botched lobotomy to actually have a decent level of challenge in them. Heroics would be harder than they are today, and the achievement quest line would involve doing heroic dungeons. This overall would mean that you would hit max level, you would spend some time popping in and out of normal dungeons and collecting bits of starter gear from around the place. Once that's done, you'd embark on your journey through all of the set group content of the expansion. And that would set you off on a journey that eventually culminates in a really badass raid tier. Now, there are lots of things to clear up here, so let's just race through a bunch of them. One thing is that the achievement process is a pain in the ass without good group finding tools. Back in TBC, that was certainly the case for many people who weren't playing with a super established guild. Now that we've got the pre-made group finder, that's a lot better, and hell, even doing things like those smaller raids that I described would be a lot easier. The same goes for the dungeon content. Now, the TBC process also didn't do a good job of delivering story. It was probably made in 2006 when Blizzard was far less proficient from a technical level at making narrative content. Done today, that stuff would be a giant improvement. Also, this way of doing things means that players who are eligible to raid will have actually earned their place. They'll be good enough in many ways. Currently, you can get to raid readiness without doing content that tests your skills. That's a terrible shame, and I think that actually hurts everyone. If you're a raider, then having this process would mean that you have a larger pool of competent players to draw from. But if you're not a raider, then A, well, if you don't want to raid anyway, it's not going to affect you that much, and B, it delivers loads of high-quality, narrative content with cool rewards that isn't crazy hard, that can also be chipped away at in your own time. And when I talk about narrative content, I mean like full-on cutscenes like the ones in Warlords of Draenor, and full voice acting throughout. Proper, high-quality stuff, which honestly, some MMOs are doing better than World of Warcraft is right now. Much of this does sound like a souped-up legendary quest, and the truth is that in some ways you're right, and the Warlords of Draenor legendary quest did some elements that I described before it basically descended into its usual LFR grindfest that we have now. Alts and catching up are a little bit of a concern with a system like this. On the topic of alts, well, I suppose there isn't much of a problem. The likes of the Legendary Quest are annoying for alts because of their big-time, grinding mechanics. A system like this doesn't really have that concern. The very later stages, perhaps say a final raid, might have more of a gear requirement, but it's in that case not much different from trying to get into Hellfire Citadel in a fresh ding today. You're just going through the set content. You're not waiting weeks to farm stones for your legendary quest or something silly like that. And hopefully the content of this would stay relevant throughout the expansion due to less item level bloating and some of the Warlords' just gear absurdity. Alternatively, they could keep it relevant using scaling as they have done during this expansion, though I don't really like how every single patch invalidates all the content of the preceding patch. I mean, come on. Having that happen to a far smaller degree, I think would give content more longevity and work better in a system like this. Honestly, much of this just comes down to the idea of, well, just designing a really good RPG first, rather than spending so much time, designing convoluted, artificial excitement, instant gratification mechanics. I think that if they were to implement a attunement-ish system, or we could just, call it the main storyline of the endgame, I think that could deliver some brilliant content, certainly some more engaging content than Warlords of Draenor had, and provide a lot of fun for people. Because you know what? For many people, the idea of, oh yeah, I'll do all my LFRs this week so I get enough stones for my legendary quest, isn't that compelling, but perhaps the idea of going through a bunch of dungeons with a unique story, getting some cool bits of set gear, it's the sort of thing you can chip away at for an hour every night, and you're always moving forward and getting something new. And that really is important, the idea of moving forward, of progressing, of having a journey. I think a journey is a lot more fun if you actually go somewhere, rather than technically walk 10 miles, but look down and see you've just walked 10 bloody miles on a treadmill. That's what Warlords of Draenor sort of did. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching this video. Hit me up on Twitter if you want to discuss it more, and I will see you next time.